Donald Trump has a habit of oversimplifying. Economics are reduced to taxes are bad, tariffs are good, and millions of migrants are reduced to people from mental institutions. His latest oversimplification is Ukraine hasn't got the cards. 4 times Trump said this to President Zelensky in the now infamous Oval Office meeting. As if the 3-year-long Ukraine war is just Putin and Zelensky playing poker. During the US presidential election, Trump made the colossal mistake of claiming he could end the Ukraine war in just 24 hours. No one with insight into Ukraine and Russia believed that claim, but on and on Trump kept repeating it. Because to him, it doesn't matter what Putin has done to Ukraine, how many Ukrainian women have been raped, how many men have been tortured, how many children have been abducted, or how much land has been stolen. Trump thinks he can just pull the plug on Ukraine like he pulled the plug on Afghanistan, leaving 20 million women behind to be forced back into oppression under the Taliban. There are no consequences serious enough to give him pause, because to Donald Trump, Ukraine is just an asset in a business deal meant to benefit Donald Trump. But is it true that Ukraine hasn't got the cards? Or is it in fact Putin who is losing the war? Let's take a closer look. Many aspects of the war are changing in Ukraine's favor. And in this episode, I will give you 3 examples of what Trump conveniently forgets when he says Ukraine hasn't got the cards. To explain each aspect, I will be using traffic light colors, with red illustrating that an aspect works against Ukraine, yellow being somewhat neutral, and green illustrating that Ukraine has the advantage. We begin with the important aspect of external support. Because this war is an asymmetrical conflict between 2 very different nations. The fact that Russia started with the most powerful military and the bigger economy could have led to a swift Russian victory, were it not for the external support for Ukraine. When the war began in early 2022, Ukraine didn't have the strong alliances it has today, and many countries had reservations about sending weapons to Ukraine. One example is Germany, which initially only sent a field hospital and helmets to avoid sending weapons. It took more than a year before the first German Leopard 2 tanks arrived. Russia didn't receive any external support either. From time to time, Russian propaganda has portrayed Russia as a country with strong alliances. But this is not the case. For example, in the summer of 2022, the Kremlin shared many photos of Putin in Iran, at a meeting with the Iranian Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And a few months later, the first Iranian Shahed kamikaze drones were used by Russia to attack Ukraine. But these drones were not a gift from an ally. They were a $1.75 billion arms deal between Russia and Iran. Similarly, in November of 2023, more than 2,000 Desert Cross all-terrain vehicles showed up on the Russian side. And because these vehicles are manufactured in China, Putin made sure the press received pictures of him next to the vehicle, sparking fear that China was now supporting Putin's war. But China is not sending weapons to Russia. The Desert Cross is an open, unarmed and unarmored civilian buggy, which was bought by Russia for $20,500 per vehicle. And finally, North Korea sent 11,000 troops to Russia in October last year, and another 3,000 more recently. But according to South Korean intelligence, Russia is paying $2,000 per month for each soldier, again limiting Putin's military to what he can afford. The Russian defense industry now employs 3.5 million people, making up 20% of all manufacturing jobs in Russia. And even though many of the 6,000 military companies in Russia work in 24-hour operation, they still cannot keep up with the losses of materiel on the battlefield. This is the reason we keep seeing makeshift solutions in the Russian army, like using donkeys or horses for transporting artillery grenades and vulnerable e-scooters for transporting soldiers to the front line. But when Russia is not supported by allies, could Putin just produce more materiel or buy more? Russia may find it hard to convert even more factories to arms production, as the civilian production of clothing, tools, appliances, and what have you is still necessary, and the conversion is expensive. Putin's even bigger problem is he's running out of money. We've already seen Putin increase taxes, and according to Swedish economist Anders Åslund, the liquid reserves in Putin's war chest, the so-called National Wealth Fund, may run out as early as late 2025. And on top of that, Putin is finding it increasingly difficult to borrow money abroad. Now compare that to Ukraine, which has 50 wealthy allies that keep on donating modern military hardware like tanks, artillery pieces, radars, drones and fighter jets, while also investing billions in Ukraine's own defense industry. In the long term, this puts Ukraine in a much more sustainable position than Russia. As I showed in my earlier episode called Is Russia Invincible?, the economy of these allies is 32 times larger than Russia's economy. So long term, this is an arms race Putin will lose. To summarize, I will show the external support in yellow in the beginning of the war, where Russia had no external support and the Ukraine support was still quite weak. But for 2025, I will mark the external support green because Russia still receives no external support, while the Ukraine support has become formidable. Next, we will look at military dominance. When this war began, Putin thought he could win in a matter of days, which is why Russian soldiers were instructed to bring parade uniforms to Ukraine. This self-confidence was sparked by Russia's military advantage. In the very beginning, Russia dominated all three military domains, air, land and sea, helped along by the element of surprise. But after 3 years of war, Russia has not achieved air superiority. Instead, they've lost hundreds of aircraft and air defense systems, which has forced Russia to pull back its air force. At the same time, Ukrainian fighter pilots have been trained abroad, and Ukraine has received both F-16 fighter jets and Mirage 2000 fighters from European countries, giving Ukraine access to a long list of NATO bombs and missiles compatible with these aircraft. Surveillance and control aircraft have arrived from Sweden, and a long list of air defense systems have been donated by Canada, Norway, Germany, and other allies. This is why Ukraine is now much stronger in the air domain. It's been the same story at sea, where Russia was dominating with its Black Sea Fleet, which has since lost so many ships to the sea drones invented by Ukraine that Russia has been forced to pull back to Russian harbors. And on land, Russia now controls less territory than they did during the invasion. Some of the skilled Russian regiments have been completely annihilated, and Putin has been forced to recruit inmates from prisons and sending wounded soldiers to fight. Desperate decisions which have serious consequences for military force quality. On February 10, 2025, the International Institute for Strategic Studies estimated that Russia had lost 14,000 tanks and armored vehicles in the war. On average, that's 13 vehicles every single day. At the same time, the Institute estimates that it takes Russia 4 days to produce just one of their new T-90M tanks. This is obviously unsustainable. What has kept the Russian army in the fight is the refurbishment of old Soviet-era vehicles, and British intelligence estimates that Putin has been able to add 11,600 old vehicles to his army this way. However, satellite images now show that their old vehicle stocks are being depleted, and the Institute for Strategic Studies assesses Russia will not have sufficient main battle tanks to conduct effective offensive operations beyond early 2026. Let me rephrase that. We are less than 1 year away from what could become the tipping point in this war, where Russia runs out of essential equipment, while production of military hardware in Ukraine and the allied countries just keeps on growing. I believe this will be the beginning of the end for Putin's invasion. On Russian state TV, they like to celebrate that on the East Front, the Russian army slowly eats its way into Ukraine, taking a wheat field here and a farmhouse there. But Ukraine is the size of Germany and Poland combined, or the size of Texas in the US. So at this pace, Russia will not take all of Ukraine in Putin's lifetime. To summarize, I will mark the military dominance red for the beginning of the war, indicating Russian superiority. But the continued delivery of modern weapons from Ukraine's allies and the innovative Ukrainian arms production has made Ukraine stronger, illustrated by the fact that Russia is no longer able to gain significant ground. So for 2025, I will mark the military dominance yellow, indicating near military parity. And once Putin runs out of tanks next year, I expect this to turn green, indicating Ukrainian military superiority. Finally, we will look at the geography of the war, because Putin has survived politically in Russia by keeping the Ukraine war out of Russian territory. In the beginning, the war was just a special military operation in a country 500 kilometers away from Moscow. Russia was sanctioned, inflation has skyrocketed, and Russians can no longer travel to many countries. But for a long time, the more deadly, more destructive consequences of the war were kept inside Ukraine. All of that changed on May 30, 2023, when Ukraine attacked Russia's capital Moscow with 8 of their newly invented drone, the Beaver. While the attack itself was not particularly successful, the psychological effect was clear. Russians could no longer ignore the war. From that point on, Ukraine has developed a series of attack drones with increasing range, even a 3,000-kilometer drone, which will allow Ukraine to attack targets as far away as Novosibirsk. So, throughout 2024, the attacks inside Russia increased significantly, and Russia has lost countless oil refineries, ammo depots, command bunkers, and a wide range of aircraft and on-the-ground installations at Russian bases. Moreover, Ukraine has been able to carry out assassinations in Moscow. And since August 2024, Ukraine has even occupied the Russian oblast of Kursk. We've gone from a situation of war in Ukraine to a war with Ukraine that increasingly leads to death and destruction inside Russia. Now, the first 3 years of war had a devastating impact on Ukraine, with entire cities being leveled to the ground. But moving the war onto Russian land means Russia is now leveling buildings in Kursk, with bombs that would otherwise have been used in Ukraine. While Ukraine is destroying the Russian oil sector, which has kept Putin's economy afloat. To summarize, I will mark the geography red in the beginning of the war, where most of the fighting was inside Ukraine, while for 2025, I will use yellow because we're now seeing death and destruction in the entire geography of both Russia and Ukraine. What we have seen is just 3 examples of how the war is turning in Ukraine's favor. But if Russia is moving towards defeat, why would Trump say Ukraine hasn't got the cards? To understand this, we need to think back to 2023, when Trump made his first presidential campaign appearance at a CNN town hall in New Hampshire. This was a key moment for his campaign, but also a difficult one because Trump was bogged down by legal troubles. A jury had just voted to indict Trump for falsifying business records. He was also being investigated for his role in the January 6 attack, his mishandling of classified documents, and his efforts to overturn the 2020 elections in Georgia. And on top of that, a jury in New York had just found that he sexually abused author E. Jean Carroll. Certainly not a good start for his presidential campaign. But Trump did not want the town hall to be about all that. He needed to say something which would change the media headlines. And Trump was in a room full of Republican fans, so he knew he would get a good response by acting like a strong man.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
How would you settle that war in one day?
The crazy thing about this statement is it was said before Trump was elected president, so before the US Department of Defense could give him the full picture of the war and advise him on a viable Ukraine strategy. Trump didn't care what military experts would tell him. He needed to look strong, so he simply made it up he could end the war in 24 hours. A weakness of the statement was it painted Trump into a corner. It now became an election promise that the Ukraine war would end. And 24 hours after his inauguration, everyone could see Trump had failed to stop the war. Now, a normal person might simply admit he was wrong and move on, but not Donald Trump. He got completely obsessed with the idea that the war had to end, no matter the consequences for Ukraine, because the great Donald Trump had said so. This is why the last couple of months we've seen him spin an entire web of lies to pressure Ukraine into complying with his fantasy. On February 12, Trump said Ukraine couldn't become a member of NATO because the Russians would never allow it. This is obviously false, as every country joining NATO the last 30 years did so under protests from Russia. Trump also claimed that Ukraine couldn't get all their land back because the Russians had fought hard for what they now occupied. Looking back at World War II, this really makes you wonder how the Allied forces ever freed Europe, which the Nazis had fought so hard to invade. On February 19, Trump tried to rewrite history by claiming that Ukraine somehow started the war. And Trump has even called Ukrainian President Zelensky a dictator, arguing that Ukraine hasn't had an election since 2019. The fact is, Zelensky was democratically elected with 75% of the vote. And while it is true that Ukraine has postponed its planned 2024 elections, this is perfectly normal in times of war. The United Kingdom did so in World War II, but that does not make Winston Churchill a dictator. To put even more pressure on Zelensky, Trump's most bizarre claim has been that only 4% of Ukrainians now approve of Zelensky's presidency. The actual number is 67%. So, with all these lies in mind, it's not surprising that in that Oval Office meeting with Zelensky, Trump falsely claimed Ukraine hasn't got the cards. As we have seen in this episode, the situation is much more nuanced. Trump has overlooked the important fact that Ukraine has 50 allies, real allies, that want Ukraine to win. Canada, the UK, the EU, Japan, Australia, and all the other allies would of course prefer fighting the Russian dictatorship with the US on the side of democracy. But Trump betraying the allies is not the end of the alliance. The allied countries are now increasing their support for Ukraine, adding billions of dollars to Ukraine's wartime budget, and sending even more advanced weapons to Ukraine. At the EU level, the Rearm Europe plan will increase military spending by €800 billion. That's a military investment 7 times larger than what the US has spent in the Ukraine war. New arms factories are opening all over Europe, and companies like Volkswagen now want to convert civilian factory sites to produce military hardware. All of the above will give Zelensky some excellent cards on his hands, while Putin and his struggling economy is fighting on borrowed time. Trump likes to think he's a great businessman, but there's a war in Europe, and the war is not his business. This war is a war for freedom, and every Canadian, every European, every Japanese, and every Australian knows this is a war we must win. So it doesn't matter that Trump has proven to be a coward-in-chief. Trump may write the US out of this important chapter of history, but the history of Ukrainian victory will still be written.